from 8 p.m., American Public Media.
Liberty Life, the pro-military paper and audio articles from Kings Bay to Camp Blanding. Serves Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, and Marines. Liberty Life is available wherever the military, veterans, and their families gather. Online at libertylifemedia.com.
North Florida TPO, proud sponsor of WJCT's First Coast Connect, bringing to the community innovation in transportation planning, commuter services, clean fuels, and intelligent transportation systems. More at northfloridatpo.com.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Transition from becoming a listener to a listener supporter. Call 353-9528 or go to WJCT.org and pledge. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and on today's First Coast Connect, as Hurricane Helene takes aim at Florida, we get the latest forecast from First Coast News meteorologist Lou Turner and an update on preparations and potential impacts from the city's emergency preparedness chief, Andre Ayub. Then, under the influence and under interrogation, we discuss new research exploring how drug or alcohol impairment impacts the rights of defendants. Plus, as the storm winds intensify, we get a refresher on when and whether local bridges could be closed. Join the conversation. You can reach us on air at 904-549-2937 or email questions or comments to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. Hurricane Helene has strengthened to a Category 2 storm in the Gulf of Mexico. Top sustained winds are at 100 miles per hour. Forecasters say it's expected to make landfall on Florida's Gulf Coast later today. The storm will move north into Georgia. From member station WABE, Melissa Fato reports Georgia officials are preparing for unprecedented weather.
Helene's track takes it all the way up through North Georgia, where tropical storms seldom reach. Nearly the entire state is under a hurricane or tropical storm warning. Governor Brian Kemp issued a state of emergency earlier this week, mobilizing all state resources ahead of the wind and rain. But officials are warning resources might be spread thin because of Helene's near-total impact on the state. Georgia Emergency Management Agency Director Chris Stallings says help like power restoration may take long to arrive.
I think we're going to see some significant power outages, probably nothing like we've seen because it's 159 counties wide.
Officials say residents should be prepared to be self-sufficient for up to 3 days. For NPR News, I'm Melissa Fato in Atlanta.
Congress has passed a stopgap spending bill to fund government agencies through December 20th. House Speaker Mike Johnson needed Democratic votes to get the measure through his chamber. But the Speaker blamed the Democratically led Senate for delays in passing the funding bill.
The House did the necessary thing. We took the initiative and passed a clean, narrow 3-month CR to prevent the Senate from jamming us with another bloated bill.
But the Speaker had to withdraw an earlier version of the spending bill. That's partly because members of his own party demanded he include a controversial measure that stops non-citizens from voting. That is already illegal. Other Republicans are calling for a more thoughtful approach to government funding measures, including a return to individual spending bills rather than passing one gigantic one. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will meet President Biden at the White House today. In a recent New Yorker interview, Zelensky called GOP vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance and his plan to end the war in Ukraine too radical. From member station WCMU, A.J. Jones reports on Vance's response at a Michigan rally.
Vance suggested barring Ukraine from NATO membership and setting up a demilitarized zone in the country could bring an end to the war. Zelensky called it a bad plan and said it would require giving up territory. In Traverse City, Vance responded to Zelensky's criticism, saying Trump can end the war.
I don't appreciate Zelensky coming to this country and telling the American taxpayers what they ought to do. He ought to say thank you to the American taxpayers.
That same day at a rally in North Carolina, Trump said Zelensky, quote, refused to make a deal, that Ukraine has been destroyed and is unable to be rebuilt. For NPR News, I'm A.J. Jones in Traverse City, Michigan.
It's NPR.
And it's now 4 minutes after 9. This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. The eye wall of the monster hurricane Helene is forecast to slam into the Gulf Coast west of Tallahassee this evening, bringing the storm surge of up to 20 feet to parts of the Panhandle. Here in Clay County, they are monitoring the water levels along Black Creek due to a potential flooding risk associated with the storm. But Emergency Management Director Tim Devon says the county is expecting this storm to be more of a wind event.
Wind gusts and tornadoes remain a threat for this storm, so residents who live in mobile homes, RVs, older homes, or on boats in our community should consider relocating.
Devon also says garbage collection will be picked up as normal today and tomorrow. Jacksonville is operating 5 emergency shelters for people who would feel safer leaving their homes during Helene. Some of those are locally Landmark Middle School on Kernan Boulevard on the east side. That's open to the general population and to pets. Ones that are not open to pets, Chaffee Trail Elementary School, that's on Sam Caruso Way, and La Villa School of the Arts on North Davis Street downtown. They are open to anyone who needs emergency shelter. However, no pets are welcome to those. 82 degrees now, very cloudy in Jacksonville. We expect thunderstorms and more activity around later this afternoon and 5 p.m. High temperature today, 84 degrees.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Fisher Investments. Fisher is committed to helping clients stay on track to reach their financial goals and enjoy a comfortable retirement. FisherInvestments.com. Investing in securities involves the risk of loss.
Weather impacts from Hurricane Helene. We get an update from First Coast News meteorologist Lou Turner, and we hear the latest from the city's emergency preparedness chief, Andre Ayub, on operations and expected impacts. Later in the program, new research explores whether suspects and defendants under the influence can sufficiently understand their rights under questioning by law enforcement. But first, the latest on Hurricane Helene. The rapidly intensifying storm is headed toward the eastern panhandle, but impacts are already making their way to the First Coast. Joining us by phone to catch us up to date is a very busy man, First Coast News meteorologist Lou Turner. Lou, thank you for being here, and thanks for making time for us.
At least 5 minutes for you.
Oh, at least 5 minutes. I appreciate it. Thanks, Lou.
You've got that coming from me anytime you need it.
That's terrific. So you are running around getting the latest updates. Lou, tell us what we know now about where this storm is headed and what impacts we might be seeing in our area.
You know, during the update that y'all just did, it was really nailed it. It was the spot on forecast. So looking at Big Bend is a big area, hence the name. Landfall tonight, somewhere 8 to 10. Some slower models would be 10 o'clock at night, official landfall. And to be more precise with Big Bend, it looks a lot like Appalachia Bay, so closer to maybe Perry, Florida, if you're familiar with that area. And those folks are going to be dealing with 20-foot storm surge. It's a water and a wind event for them tonight, and that's going to impact Tallahassee as well. You know, if you, it's not my network or anything, but shout out Weather Channel. You know, you follow where Jim Cantori is, and Cantori set up in Tallahassee. That's the Cantori index right now. And folks ask that question, well, where's Cantori? That's where he is. He's in Tally, and that's probably an indicator of the big impacts they're going to have there. Lots of wind. Now, you know, for us, it's going to be a later afternoon. We have to be patient with this, and I know a lot of people get anxiety with just the wait, but it's a tonight thing, and that's the scariest part for a lot of people.
So, Lou, my news director is monitoring a presser that the governor is giving right now, and she says that he just said, you have time to get to a shelter, but you need to do it now. And that apparently this track that's gone a little bit east could be very bad for Tallahassee.
Correct. Yeah. So I know FSU, FAMU, they've shut things down. Obviously, the big universities. There are a lot of families we've been asked that question a lot because a lot of families concerned about students there in semester. They've shut it down, either sent them home and they've set up shelters there. And there is time because this is this is going to be an 8 to 10:30 sort of landfall event when the absolute worst is happening. And you're talking 120, 130 mile an hour wind sustained there. And there's a lot of old trees. There's a lot of roads that will be impacted, homes that'll be impacted by this, and that's just inevitable. And along the coast, a lot of those communities, St. Mark's, Perry, Sopchoppy, you get over to Apalachicola and Cedar Key, even along the very eastern edges of this, Steinhatchee, a lot of folks know, going to be dealing with a great deal of that 20-foot storm surge. And so the shelter is a great idea for those folks in the hurricane warning area, but that does include Lake City, Columbia County, in what's technically the first coast, right? So Columbia County, Lake City, right there along the I-75 corridor, could get 90-mile-an-hour winds with this, with isolated tornadoes. So that'll be, an overnight thing. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of having a way to get alerts, having phones charged, your devices charged. If, you think you might be trying to get a little bit of sleep and just rest through it, but have a way to be woken up when and if, I should say, but also definitely when tornado warnings are issued, because it looks very likely that this will be a wind tornado event for most of us along the First Coast tonight.
And we're not seeing local evacuations here, but we do know that there's a point at which it is not safe for people to leave. Do you have a sense as to when that is, if someone is going to evacuate, when they need to do that by?
So the old saying is you run from the water, you hide from the wind. But if you have a home or a situation, whatever it is, that you're just not comfortable being in with a wind situation, I don't blame anyone for saying I need better shelter. I need to seek better shelter, seek higher ground, whatever that may be. You probably need to be in a good, comfortable place before 6 o'clock tonight. I think 6 p.m., it's like a volume knob. We're turning the volume up on this thing, slowly starting around a little after lunch. And then by 6 o'clock tonight is when things really ramp up and the waves of these bands start coming on shore, right? So you get the feeder band. So certainly the eye wall is going to be 150 miles away from us. But with the feeder bands coming off the Atlantic and feeding back into it, you get these spin-ups happening. And that can happen anywhere coastally. It can happen anywhere, within our First Coast in southeast Georgia. You can get these tornadoes. So we'll be a tornado watch through the afternoon. We'll be prepared for the warnings. Those are the more serious layer. And I'd say by 6, get to where you're going to be and stay there. And there's no reason to get on the roads tonight and have those ways to get broadcast alerts.
Well, Lou Turner, we know that you're going to be on the air and monitoring this storm heavily for the next 48 hours. But thank you for making time for this. Be safe. And
if you need me again, call me. I'm happy to help anytime. I know you get a lot of listeners at all times. So just, anything you need, you give me a call. But this is a situation, by tomorrow morning, we're doing a lot better, right? So this ends pretty quickly. As quickly as it's going to get started, it's a fast mover. And it'll be out of our area by the time we get to mid-morning to early afternoon Friday.
Well, that's a good piece of news, and we appreciate it. Thank you, Lou Turner from First Coast News. Thanks so much.
Anytime. Take care.
We're going to turn now to the city of Jacksonville's Emergency Preparedness Division Chief, Andre Ayub. He is on the line. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Good morning, Ann. How are you, ma'am? Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. So what can you tell us ahead of this storm right now in terms of what the city is seeing and what the city is preparing for?
Absolutely. So, if you've heard Mayor Deegan and Angie and Yeti and NWS, we've done several press conferences and also through our Jax Ready app, we continue to talk about preparation. As Lou Turner just mentioned, you still have a couple hours before we start seeing some onset of some storm winds to prepare. I always talk about getting your emergency kit ready, having a plan, evacuation zone, and staying informed. So this is the big thing right now, just being prepared. And I think everybody from the national, state, and local meteorologists are saying today's the day to hunker down. It's a weather day. Hopefully people are heeding our recommendations. Grab, some snacks, some food, and some movies, and just hunker down and stay safe.
And so what, if any, impacts on city infrastructure are you anticipating?
No, that's another good question. So, the information I'm getting, as Lou just mentioned, our peak time today is going to be from 6 p.m. to midnight. We're looking at sustained winds about 45 miles per hour. which is tropical storm force winds, and gusts up to 65. So that could impact trees. We've, for the past, 2-3 weeks, we've had excessive amount of rain. So that can impact the trees being uprooted. When trees are uprooted, they fall on power lines. Then you got water, that's on roadways. So there's so many things that could potentially happen. But let me tell you the awesome thing, and I'm proud of to be part of this. And, here at DOC, our collaboration with all our partners from JTA, JEA, Public Works, JSO, JFRD, and many Red Cross, Department of Health. We've got so many partners that are here, and we're all on the same page. So whatever the need is, all the partners are here and ready to deploy and assist our community.
So in terms of the heaviest period that you're anticipating, is there a time that you're telling people to just stay off the roads? I mean, was that kind of the 6 o'clock threshold that you and Lou have both mentioned?
Well, let me tell you, I would actually, what I'm saying, and I'm not going against Lou because that was great information. I mean, you're going to start seeing that, around noon today. Noon today, it's about 6 p.m. You're going to see some sustained winds up to 40 miles per hour, some gusts up to 60. So I would tell right now, you're talking about 9:13 a.m. I think you have a couple hours. If there's some things that you haven't got for your kid or for the house, you got a couple hours to get that and then hunker down by noon and just stay home. Stay home for the remainder of the night, and that, a lot of information that we're getting, especially you mentioned the governor's report right now. All the meteorologists saying that this storm is fast moving and it's going to be out of here fast. So hopefully by early Friday morning, the storm is going to be gone, and then people, hopefully we don't have any significant impacts and people can go back to their regular day-to-day operations.
What about power outages? Are you expecting that to be a widespread problem on the First Coast?
Like I said, that's a potential, but we're prepared. If you heard the CEO from JEA, she's talked about that. She's got some more resources from throughout the country here staged up. So they're preparing for the worst, but hoping for the best. So if that happens, we have the resources here to address it, and hopefully it's going to be a short time period that people are out the electricity.
Well, we've been talking to the city's Emergency Preparedness Division Chief, Andre Ayub. Sir, hopefully we will be able to check in with you again. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, and please be safe out there. There's some new research exploring how drug and alcohol impairment impacts the rights of defendants. To talk about it, I'm joined by a lead researcher on a new project that looked at this very issue, Jacqueline Evans. She's the director of the Legal Psychology Graduate Program at Florida International University in Miami. Good morning, Jacqueline. Thanks for being here.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me, especially on a day that is a very Florida day during hurricane season.
It is a very Florida day, and hopefully you're safe down in Miami. It looks like that's a better place to be than some. I'm also joined by DUI criminal defense attorney Susan Cohen. Good morning, Susan.
Good morning.
And retired federal law enforcement officer and safety analyst Mark Baughman. Good morning, Mark.
Morning, Ann.
So, Jacqueline, let's start, if we can, with your research. We'll get into the details of the study, but broadly speaking, what did you find?
So our most recent project was looking at the impact of intoxication when somebody is undergoing an interrogation. And overall, we didn't find a statistically significant effect suggesting that intoxicated people were more vulnerable, but we did find they were highly likely to say something that was suggestive or would be seen as suspicious by somebody questioning them. And we also found that while we had only a few false confessions across our study, all of them were people who were intoxicated at the time.
And so we know generally that intoxication can impair a suspect's comprehension, or really anyone's comprehension. And also that intoxicated suspects are believed to be likelier to make incriminating statements, even if they're innocent.
That was what we were predicting to find. Absolutely. Like I said, we didn't find statistically significant results in that direction, but the overall trend did support that.
So what prompted you to look at this topic in the first place?
Well, the trajectory of my research actually started almost exactly 20 years ago. My very first semester of graduate school, I proposed a study. That one was looking at the impact of intoxication on a witness to a crime. And then started doing research in the area of witnesses who were intoxicated for several years. And then as my career developed, I sort of transitioned more to looking at interrogations instead of witness interviews. And so naturally, my interest in intoxication also kind of headed in that direction.
So, Susan Cohen, why is this kind of research important? What are the implications?
Well, anytime you have a defendant waiving their right, any of their rights, but particularly their right to counsel, one of the underlying things that has to be determined by the court is that it was knowingly and voluntarily waived. And so the question is whether or not they were capable of making that kind of waiver if they were intoxicated. And I think you do, though, have to make a distinction between DUI cases and other types of criminal cases. In most cases, in a DUI case, in terms of the argument of whether they're being intoxicated would make them unable to waive their rights, puts everybody in an awkward position because the defendant either has to argue they were impaired so they couldn't waive their right, or the state has to argue they weren't impaired, which goes against the grain. And normally it would be done in a pretrial hearing. The main times we run into that on a DUI is going to be if the person is not in the car. And we have had cases, I know that it's not a statistical study, but we have had cases where people were not the driver who admitted to being the driver. And only later we were able to actually show that even though they had pled guilty to the charge, they were not the person who was driving at the time. So it has a lot of implications as far as that goes. But I think the bigger implication is sometimes even a DUI stop leads to other types of charges. And so once you get into that, you're going to have a more intensive interrogation. And then I think it becomes a bigger factor.
And you were saying to me before the program that in terms of like a Miranda right type situation where someone is being informed of their right to remain silent and to have an attorney present and all of that, that typically doesn't come into play at the beginning of a DUI stop, that there's very often this is happening outside of an interrogation room prior to a kind of a required formal reading of someone's rights.
Well, what happens is at the initial part of the stop, there's going to be some questions asked and there's going to be discussion, but your rights under Miranda begin and the necessity to warn somebody of those rights apply only to custodial interrogation. So one, you have to be in custody, and two, the officer has to be questioning you. So anything you just voluntarily say where there's no questions is admissible and unrelated to this issue. I mean, you may be impaired and you may offer information, but that's a whole different situation. Also, custody. So on a DUI, where that degree of custody that requires the Miranda is constantly moving. There are some aspects of the DUI investigation that Miranda warnings are given when you have to give verbal responses. And it depends, it's generally later on into the investigation, but you're right, it's not in an interrogation room. So it's a little bit different under those circumstances. If they were to interrogate you once you're in cuffs and you're in the back of the car, then clearly that's a Miranda situation. But there's just not as much interrogation involved in a DUI. They typically will ask you things like, how much have you had to drink? What did you have to drink? Where are you coming from? Things like that, that would implicate Miranda. And then one of the questions they like to ask is on a scale of 1 to 10, how impaired are you? Well, I mean, if you give a low number, that's seen as, well, you're too impaired to know. And if you give a high number, then it can be implicating to you. But those types of things are more likely when the Miranda issue arises.
So, Mark, you have worked in vice and narcotics, and I'm guessing that some of those suspects were on occasion impaired that you were dealing with. So what are the parameters for interrogations when you are dealing with somebody who is intoxicated?
I mean, if they're to the point where they can't talk, I mean, there's no need to even bother talking to them at that point. I mean, there are times that you have people that you engage, whether it be a traffic stop or another crime, that they're almost incoherent or their eyes are rolling back in their head or whatever. It doesn't do any good for law enforcement to try and get that statement out of them at that point because it's probably going to get challenged, and it should be. You're trying to look for other indicators and other witnesses if it's not a DUI and it's a case to corroborate maybe or find out or tie to whatever that person may or may not know. people you're interviewing that may be inebriated or impaired in some way, you're going to independently corroborate with somebody else. You're not going to solely rely on that, and you shouldn't. As far as DUIs go, I started in law enforcement in 1979, so there were no cameras. There were no dash cameras. There were no body cameras. We base everything on observations. What's the initial observation is how they're driving. That's the reason why you pull them over. So you're starting to take a thread, and you're trying to tie it all together. You engage the individual, and you smell the alcohol on them, or maybe not, but they're somehow impaired. First, make sure they're not medically, there's something wrong right away, because that happens a lot. And nowadays, people, unfortunately, medicines do strange things to people. Even though they're prescribed it, they may have over-medicated themselves. They may have mixed medicine with alcohol. They may have had one or two drinks, but they've taken it with a Xanax or whatever. Now they could be impaired. So these are the things you have to take into consideration. We would have to document things thoroughly, all right? And again, you're not going to get to a Miranda situation until it looks like you're going to put this person and take them into custody. There's times I've stopped people and I've let them go. They're not impaired. They may have had something to drink. Admittedly, they may have said, I've had a drink, or I've had one or two drinks. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm putting them in jail.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about questioning suspects who are under the influence, and we want to hear from you. Do you think it's appropriate? Do you think that it's fair game? Call us at 904-549-2937, or you can email comments and questions to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. Jacqueline, you begin with an example of someone who is impaired and crashes a car with a blood alcohol level of 0.291, which is nearly 3 times the legal limit. This person would be slurring and having trouble standing in your example. Is everything he says considered legally admissible in court?
In the particular case that you're referring to, that is what the court decided. I believe in that case, the court initially said that it wasn't admissible, but an appeals court said that it was. So it went back down. So obviously everything is decided on a case-by-case basis. There are going to be cases where somebody might end up successfully arguing that what they said should not be admissible, but it very frequently is deemed to be admissible.
Susan Cohen, what is the case law predominantly on this issue? And have you made these kind of arguments in court?
It boils down to it's one of these totality of the circumstances situations. And so what the court's going to look at is everything that happened. Was it more coercive? Did they appear to understand? Did they say they understood? There's a lot of things, having worked within the criminal justice system for a very long time, there are a lot of legal fictions, if you will. And so particularly in a DUI, because what a jury has to find that somebody is guilty of DUI is that their normal faculties are impaired. And normal faculties are defined in the jury instructions, among other things, is their ability to make judgment and to do mental tasks, which would both relate directly to your ability to knowingly and understandingly waive your rights under Miranda. So it would appear that those would be two things that just would not be able to be reconcilable. But I mean, over the years, we've made attempts to raise that issue, but it always is a very difficult one from a legal standpoint for the reasons like she's indicated, that a lot of the case law is, well, they seem to understand that it wasn't overly coercive. They didn't ask for all these factors that go into making the decision. And so sometimes it almost looks like it's form over substance. As long as you do all the right things and you say all the right things, then it's going to be admissible. And it is a difficult argument to make.
Difficult because of how it's received by jurors, or just difficult legally?
Well, generally, you're going to make that argument to the judge in a pretrial motion to keep the statement out. And like I said, especially in a DUI, although you can make it the argument my client was too impaired in a pretrial motion, it's a little different than standing in front of a jury. The argument in front of a jury is always going to be a difficult one in terms of a DUI because, again, you don't want to get up there and argue that your client was too impaired to waive their rights, but they were safe to drive. So it's going to, but it would certainly be a factor in another kind of criminal case that certainly might have greater weight in front of a jury who understands and can maybe be made to understand that this person was just saying things because they were impaired and they just wanted to say what they thought somebody wanted to hear. They're less able to make those decisions. They're less able to understand the ramifications of waiving their rights. And that's why I say it's going to be a very different argument in a DUI case versus a case where impairment is not an issue before the jury.
Jacqueline, I want to ask you a little bit about the way that you conducted this study. You had to actually bring in some student volunteers, or perhaps they were compensated, I don't know, but bringing them in and some of them had to get intoxicated. I kind of guess maybe that's not the hardest, tallest task at FIU to get someone to come and volunteer to come drink, for scientific purposes. But how do you manage that? I mean, it is an unusual circumstance where you're bringing people in and asking them to drink to the point of intoxication.
Yeah, there are not that many labs that do this kind of work, and I understand why. It's actually very complicated work to do. As you can probably imagine, there are a lot of hoops we have to jump through from an ethical point of view to make sure that people can participate safely. One of those limitations that's placed on us, which I have no concerns with, I wouldn't want to be pushing any lines, but we, for example, are not allowed to try to get anybody more intoxicated than a 0.08 level. So that's one consideration when interpreting the results of our studies is we're talking about people who are at kind of the legal limit for driving. You can reasonably expect that most effects will be larger as you get people more intoxicated. But in terms of our study, we have to have people go through a very extensive medical screening before they can participate. We ask them all kinds of things about their medical history, the potential for pregnancy, what medications they may be on, what their drinking history is. So all kinds of factors, all kinds of ways to end up volunteering for the study, but not actually being able to participate. But assuming you make it through, then yes, you're either randomly assigned to drink to the point of, again, it's a special formula based on your weight and sex to get you a dose to get you ideally to the 0.08 level, or some people are randomly assigned to not drink any alcohol. And we also had a placebo group in all of our studies where we tell them that they're going to be drinking, and we take some efforts to convince them that that's happening, but they in fact are not getting any alcohol.
But to be clear, you're not allowed to, for reasons of ethics or just policy there at the university, you're not allowed to have people drink to a point that probably many people who are stopped for DUI or people who are intoxicated under interrogation would be at. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes. There are some studies, not that I've personally conducted, but that are in the research literature where they've done field studies. So instead of doing what we do and bringing people to a controlled laboratory environment, they go out to bars and ask people to participate in some form of study, maybe a memory test or something like that. And that does allow you to capture those higher levels of intoxication because you aren't imposing that level on them. They've self-selected and chosen to drink to that point.
And Susan, just in your experience, how common is it that someone is in a case that you're involved with a, say, a 0.08 as opposed to a higher level of intoxication?
I would say that the substantial majority are not an 0.8. Most of them are higher. It may not be, not all of them are a lot higher, but and let me put it this way, because sometimes with these instruments, it's really hard to tell. I've been involved in DUI either as a prosecutor or a defense attorney for many, many, many years. And years ago, I remember if somebody blew a 0.20 or above, they were taken to the hospital. Now it is not unusual to have somebody with a 0.2 over a 0.2. So you're seeing higher numbers. I don't know that that's a correlation that people are drinking more or just the measurements that are being made, but that is a significant difference that I've seen. And so the majority of the cases that we have are not a .08. I mean, we still have those. We have some that are below a .08, but there's a substantial number of cases where they're substantially higher than that.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about research into the impact that intoxication can have on someone's ability to understand their situation or to waive their Miranda rights, and also just how it impacts someone in a situation as a witness or a defendant. You can join our conversation. You can call us at 904-549-2937. You can email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can tag us on social media. We have an email from Mark. He says, people who drive under the influence should consider how uncomfortable the legal entanglement becomes when they get a DUI. Furthermore, they should consider the social and occupational fallout. No question, it has an enormous impact on people's lives, Susan.
That's correct. And I don't disagree with anything that this gentleman has just said. And that's one of the things we address with all our clients is we're going to try to help in terms of the legal issues. And obviously, you don't want somebody's life completely destroyed going forward in their ability to maintain a livelihood and do the things they need to do. But at the same time, that they need to accept responsibility for making sure that never happens again, because it's just as dangerous for them to be on the street and for themselves as it is for anybody else. But the issue of the Miranda, when you talk about the protection of legal rights, what makes it so difficult is some cases are more a situation where you feel sorry for someone, you feel that they should be more protected, and other cases it's hard to feel sorry for people. But when you're dealing with constitutional rights and whether or not somebody is voluntarily waiving and the law and how that should be handled, you have to step back and understand that the protection of one person's rights protects all of us, and that some people who may have been coerced in confessions, as we've talked about, may not have been guilty. Some people who did not have their rights respected could be us, our children, our neighbors, people we care about, and people who we have more sympathy for. But you can't pick and choose, this person deserves to have their rights respected and this person doesn't. And that's why it's really a more general discussion and a more general concern as opposed to whether a particular individual deserves it. And that's why our system doesn't, and it is not supposed to make those individual decisions based on who the individual is. It's supposed to be made on the facts of each case.
Mark, I want to ask you, in terms of questioning someone who's involved in a case, either as a defendant, primarily, I guess, as a defendant, if there isn't a little bit of a self-fulfilling circumstance. I mean, there's been some research that shows that interrogations tend to follow the belief of the interrogator, and that if they believe that someone's guilty, they will tend to be more accusatory in their tone and in their demeanor, and that can lead to false confessions. And so the question is, if somebody is giving tells that Jacqueline's research has kind of shown that maybe they're doing something suspicious, raises a suspicion in the interrogator, does that kind of become a problem in terms of maintaining their impartiality when they're looking at a case?
Yeah, it does, of course. You have to keep in mind that when you're interviewing somebody, right, and this is somebody you're interviewing, not interrogating, right? You're wanting to know what happened. You want to know the truth, right? Sometimes you get led down that path a little bit just by what they're saying, and then all of a sudden your questioning starts changing towards that. You got to keep that in mind when you're interviewing somebody. Now, when you're interrogating somebody, you're looking for their culpability. You're wanting them to admit their guilt, right? So, yeah, you can start leading in that direction. You got to be mindful of that, especially if they're impaired. I mean, if I'm Mirandizing somebody, I'm probably going to incarcerate that person. I'm going to take them into custody. I've seen enough that I feel comfortable charging that individual with something, right? Whatever they say afterwards. In fact, I can tell you there's plenty of times when I've had people in the backseat of my car and I'm just like, do yourself a favor, don't say anything else to me. It might be better that you don't talk, right? Now, my car back then had an audio or video capability. Cameras are a game changer. Body cameras, dash cameras, audio recordings in cars, they're usually not advantageous for the person that's being interrogated / interviewed. I mean, that's the telling sign of it. A lot of times it's unsolicited. They just start talking, and you're like, don't talk. I don't want you to talk. And this happens. I'm sure you can agree with that.
Yeah.
It's not in their best interest.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you, Jacqueline, about the indicators of guilt or perhaps behavior that can trigger additional suspicion. What is it that research has shown in terms of whether people who are intoxicated have those kinds of tells?
So that's a great question because there's very little research out there at all on that question in terms of intoxicated people specifically. There's research on just people in general and the behaviors that many people, including law enforcement, are typically trained to look for. That a lot of times is going to be behavioral cues. So the big one you often hear is things like just generally appearing nervous, gaze aversion, fidgeting, things like that. But you can also have situations where it's the exact opposite that raises suspicions. If someone appears not nervous or not emotional, anytime their response doesn't seem to match what you would expect it to be, given whatever situation they're in, that can be enough to raise some eyebrows. And so that's one of the reasons that as soon as somebody starts engaging at all, they're creating a situation where they might do or say something inadvertently that would create a higher belief in guilt on the part of the person they're talking to.
We should say that we did reach out to both the 4th and the 7th state attorney's offices to see if they wanted to weigh in on this issue. We also reached out to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, and they all declined primarily because of having so many cases pending on this topic. They just didn't feel like they could do so safely. But I want to ask you, Mark, I mean, there's some people that, might say, oh, this makes a suspect more vulnerable to questioning or perhaps understanding what they're up against. But some people might view alcohol as kind of a truth serum. Maybe they're more likely to tell you honestly what happened as opposed to otherwise.
They could. Yeah, they very well could. But then again, they could make it more than what it is. I mean, one of my questions were, especially on the DUI, is how many drinks have you had tonight? All right, so everybody always has the number 2. I can't tell you, 2 is always like there. And then you're looking at them, you're like, okay, this person's 5 foot, 100 pounds maybe, or my size, which is a lot bit more than 100 pounds, and I'm a foot taller. 2 may not do that. 2 may do something else. But again, going back to the conversation with that individual, that it's more than 2 already. Now, do you want to keep talking to them at that point, or are you just making your observations? So, I mean, yeah, people, it can cut either way. It can go towards them making themselves more culpable in that sense, or they could, for a fact that it's not. You know what I mean? That the alcohol definitely is a contributing factor. And if I may add something to the study that you did here, is that the people that are drinking, their freedom's not involved here. I mean, the study's good, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, when your freedom's involved and you're in a situation where you're pulled over on the side of the road, you have the police there with you, a lot more is at stake. And now you have a different set of circumstances that are presented in front of you. Your car, if you're taken into custody, is going to be impounded. It's going to be inventoried. So if there's anything in there other than that that's contraband, it's probably going to go towards you anyway, whether you say anything or not. So, I mean, these things all get taken into consideration at the time. So these people are trying to defend themselves on the side of the road, I've seen them happen a number of times. Then I've also seen them hurt themselves on the side of the road, too. It just depends.
Jacqueline, I want to ask you about one famous case because we haven't really talked about how impairment impacts juvenile defendants or juvenile suspects. But there's a case that's sort of known as the Fairbanks 4. It involved a 17-year-old who had a blood alcohol level of 0.158 and he confessed to a crime, to a murder. Can you tell us a little bit about that case?
Well, I am not an expert in that case, but I have heard of it. I am familiar with that particular example. And what I can say is it's unfortunately not that shocking to hear that an intoxicated juvenile was questioned. There was one study that was conducted where they surveyed juveniles who were in a detention center, and about 40% of them said that they had been questioned while intoxicated at some point. So it's certainly not against kind of standard practice, at least not at the time this was conducted about 10 years ago, for that to happen. And we already know that juveniles are at risk in an interrogation context for reasons that are probably intuitive to many people, but juveniles are not great at thinking about the long-term consequences of their decisions. They tend to make more impulsive decisions, focus on the short term, and in an interrogation context, focusing on the short term is typically going to entail thinking to myself, what can I do to get out of this situation that I am not happy to be in?
Right.
And so typically confessing is how you make the interrogation stop. Whereas if you continue to deny, they're going to continue to ask you questions.
And Susan, in this case, the 17-year-old that was questioned, he confessed after 11 hours of interrogation. And in the end, 4 innocent men were convicted and spent, more than a decade in prison. They were later exonerated, but it was in part, they believe, his intoxication that led to that false confession.
Well, I think she's right. When you're dealing with juveniles, that's a whole different ballgame. Their brains are just not the same as an adult brain. Under the law, you're allowed to interrogate a juvenile, and it's the limitations are not as strong as some people might think they would be for a kid. So I think it's hard to equate that. The fact that they were impaired obviously would have a significant impact on even lowering their inhibitions. I mean, that's part of their problem, is they have no way of recognizing long-term effect or really processing things the same way you do as an adult. And so being impaired is going to obviously impact that. But also an 11-hour interrogation, number one, your level of impairment is going to obviously decrease over an 11-hour period. And I would think that particularly in a situation like that, 11 hours of interrogation is going to be the most significant aspect of why that was a problem, even if he was impaired at the beginning. So I think that's a difficult connect to make in terms of trying to equate that to the adult situation and the impaired adult, because that's a whole different discussion, I think, a whole different circumstance.
With the juvenile, too, I mean, you want a guardian or a parent there during that process. I mean, law enforcement should do that. If they're not doing it, there's something not good right there, right up front. You want, if there's not one available, then right away, then hold off. You know what I mean? Until there is somebody that's looking out for the best interest of that individual, especially a juvenile. Because as you said, they're going to say some things that they probably shouldn't be saying, whether they're impaired or not. Even at some point, they're just not prepared to go through this. It's true. They probably want to get it over with, and they may admit to something that they didn't do. So it's prudent to have somebody there that's looking out for them. And it's no different than having an attorney once it gets to that point.
And Jacqueline, we've just got about 30 seconds left, but can you tell us what reaction you've gotten so far to this study and what's next for you in terms of research?
Yeah, so we're really excited about this study because it was the only study that has ever done anything remotely like this, actually put intoxicated people in an interrogation situation where they actually had something to lose, and we were able to look at both how guilty and innocent people responded. So it's really a noteworthy study.
Scenic Jacksonville presents the annual Great Cities Symposium on October 10th. Speaker Carol Coletta has led the transformation of downtowns, parks, and riverfronts across the U.S., from Memphis to Chicago. Join the community conversation. Tickets available at scenicjacksonville.org. Amelia Island brings all styles of jazz to the Les DeMerle Amelia Island Jazz Fest, September 29th through October 6th. Celebrate contemporary, big band, Latin, swing, Dixieland, blues, and more. Info at ameliaisland.com/jazz.
I'm Jeremy Hobson. Next time on The Middle, Social Security comes up in every election, but changing it is very unpopular, and leaving it alone is unsustainable. So our question, do you think Social Security will be there for you when you need it, and what reforms, if any, should happen to the program? Call 844-4MIDDLE, that's 844-464-3353, and join us next time on The Middle.
Tonight at 9 here on WJCT News 89.9.
I'm Julia Simon, and I'm NPR's Climate Solutions reporter. Climate change is global in scale with existential stakes. It can be overwhelming to think about, but solutions aren't on any one person alone. We're all in this together. At NPR and this station, we empower you with solutions-focused coverage, and you power our reporting with your support. Donate to this station, and thank you.
Please call 353-9528 or visit us at wjct.org/radio.
Tensions are high between Israel and Hezbollah as the two trade fire. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said this on Tuesday.
Now, starting this morning, the IDF has warned you to get out of harm's way.
Israel says it's targeting sites where Hezbollah has stored weapons. The attacks are deadlier than the 2006 war between both parties. What's the possibility of an all-out war? That's next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. I'm joined now on the line by Katie Jeffries, anchor and traffic reporter at First Coast News. Katie, you've been watching the roads all morning. I've been watching you watch the roads all morning. Good morning. What are we seeing out there right now in terms of traffic?
It does look like people have been kind of heeding the warning to stay off the roads. We've seen kind of minimal traffic out there. I haven't seen any severe crashes, which is great news. But this is just still very much the beginning. Conditions are expected to deteriorate later on into this evening, and I think that's when we'll probably see more crashes, more complications with the roads.
Yeah, I was seeing on my own commute in this morning, it was just almost like a ghost town downtown, which I guess is a good thing because you and others have been warning people to stay off the roads.
Yeah, that is a great sign. I mean, because you don't want people out there, especially if the winds are really picking up, that can kind of blow your car around in the lane. So we really want people to try and stay home as much as they can. If they have to run out, go check on a parent or run errands, do that now before things get worse later on today.
And so, Katie, I want to lean on you a little bit to talk about bridges and bridge closures. That's always an issue that comes up, and people sometimes forget the rules and the guidelines surrounding that. So help us understand, which bridges might be at risk of closure and in what circumstances.
Sure. That is a question we get a lot, and I feel like people want a yes or no answer. Are they going to close? But it's something that you have to understand the context of how they make that decision. So it is 40 mile per hour sustained winds is the threshold to close a bridge. Sustained meaning it has to be at 40 miles per hour for 1 minute or more. And it's JSO along with Florida Department of Transportation. They're monitoring those wind speeds. So when it hits that threshold of 40 mile per hour sustained winds, that's when the bridges close. But our bridges are at different elevations. So the taller bridges like the Dames, the Hart, the Matthews, they will likely see stronger wind speeds before the lower elevation bridges like the Maine, the Acosta, the Fuller Warren. So even if one bridge closes, in theory, if the Dames Point Bridge closed, that does not mean all bridges are closed. So each bridge is monitored individually.
The one I think of in Georgia is the Sydney Lanier Bridge, which is, terrifying on a good day, really extremely steep and high. And that one tends to close as well, in my memory.
Yes, and that one is a bit of an outlier. Sometimes they have given their local government up there, sometimes will put out a preemptive warning about when it will close. And we haven't seen anything like that with this storm yet. But 40 miles per hour is their threshold, but sometimes the commissioners up there towards Brunswick will give the community advance warning that it's going to close. Whereas in Jacksonville, there's really not much advanced warning. It's just Once it hits that threshold, they close the bridge.
And so we talk a lot about the bridges that we think of, these iconic ones downtown, Matthews Hart, Main Street, but a lot of people live at the beaches in those communities, and they have to get across a bridge to get there. And there have been times that those bridges have been closed. So what is your sense of whether any of those could be impacted during this storm?
I'm not too worried about our intracoastal bridges at this point. I don't feel like they're at a high enough elevation to warrant any type of closure. In years past, the closures we've seen with those were due to evacuations. Like during Hurricane Matthew, they closed those intracoastal bridges so that people couldn't kind of go out to the beach and sightsee. It wasn't necessarily because of wind speed. So with those closures along the Atlantic Beach and JTB bridges, not worried about those closing during this storm.
So you talk about this threshold for closing, 40 miles per hour sustained winds, but we know that we are expecting some gusts that are probably far higher than that in this storm.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be quite an experience if you're driving through, gusts of 80, 90 miles an hour, even if the bridge is open. So what is the threshold there, and what should people be conscious of when they're driving in those really high winds?
Well, to really try, once the storm reaches that peak, after 5 p.m. tonight when we're expecting to see those strong winds, try to stay home. We've seen, even in just a strong thunderstorm, we've seen tractor trailers get tipped over, box trucks get tipped over on the Dames Point Bridge. And that was just during a thunderstorm because they got caught in some kind of straight line strong winds. So if you have a higher profile vehicle or a truck or something like that, try to stay off those bridges, especially when you hit those strong winds, because it will definitely push you around in the lane. And if you're in maybe a truck or something like that, it could tip you over if you get caught by one of those really strong gusts.
Yeah, that's really good advice, Katie. Katie Jeffries, she is an anchor at First Coast News on Good Morning Jacksonville. She's also a traffic reporter, and we so appreciate you being here this morning, Katie. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
I'm joined now by David Luckin. He is station manager here at WJCT News. He is the host of Electro Lounge, which is one of our favorite down-tempo evening. Yeah, it's your favorite show. And so we're in the midst of a pledge drive, David. So you've been on the air. We've heard from our other colleagues this morning.
Oh, and we had 10 callers this morning just in the last hour or so.
But this is a time to remind people how important it is to support this station and also this show.
Absolutely. If you're a listener of this show every day for the last 14 or 15 years, you need to give us a call at 353-9528. And the reason is this fall drive is being matched thanks to the generosity of Ullman Wealth Partners. For every dollar you donate, they will contribute $2. So now's the time.